A warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I have the honor of serving as director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center here and founded by Shelby White in 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. I think most of you are now aware of Shelby's incredibly generous grant of $10 million to our projected $20 million endowment. But please note that she has also pledged up to $5 million in matching grants. And if you give us $1 million, we'll name one of the fellowships after you. If you're interested in anyone, talk to me after this event. Just a little advertisement there. Please note that our next event will be on Wednesday, October 22nd. Is that right, Dad? The 22nd? 29th. It's with Karen Howe to discuss her biography of Sam Altman. She will be in conversation with John Borthwick, so please mark your calendars. And if you have not done so already, please register your email address on our brand new redesigned and very handsome website so that you can be notified of our future events. But tonight I'm delighted to welcome Nathan Kernan to talk about his biography of James Schuyler. He will be in conversation with Brad Gooch. Nathan Kernan is the editor of the Diary of James Schuyler. He lives in New York. If I understand correctly, Nathan has been working on this biography since 2003. He writes in his introduction, quote, "There are those who feel that biography is, at best, irrelevant to the work of an artist, which must stand alone." And then he says, "I don't share this view." I must say, neither do I. Indeed, biography may arguably be the key to understanding the work, but perhaps we will hear more of this in discussion about this issue. Brad Gooch is a poet, novelist, and biographer. His latest book, Radiant, The Life and Line of Keith Haring, was a national bestseller, a New York Times book critic's favorite book of the year, a Washington Post notable book of the year, and a Booklist top 10 art book of the year. His previous books include Rumi's Secret, The Life of the Sufi Poet of Love, Rumi Unseen Poems, translated by Brad Gooch and Mariam Mortaz, Smash Cut, a memoir of Howard and art in the 1970s and the 80s, Flannery, A Life of Flannery O'Connor, which was the National Book Critics Circle Award finalist, a New York Times notable book of the year, and a New York Times bestseller. And finally, The City Poet, The Life and Times of Frank O'Hara. Brad lives here in New York City as well. Nathan and Brad will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then they will take questions from our in-person audience. And we will also, I want to acknowledge that we have a virtual audience out there that is watching this as in live streaming. Finally, the authors will be signing books afterwards in the lobby. This event is being live streamed, so hello out there to our virtual audience. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. I now turn over the conversation to Brad Gooch.
Thank you all for being here, visible and invisible ones. You're very visible. Whenever I think of James Schuyler, I go back, especially the poetry of James Schuyler. Then I get so excited I forget the microphone. All right. Whenever I think of the, especially poetry of James Schuyler, I go back to, in the late 70s, there was a book called The Home Book that was published by Kennard Elmsley Z Press. And on the back, there was a quote from David Calstone. And it always, to me, was the kind of unchanging truth about that poetry. So I have it here so that I say it correctly. In a time when many poets have designs on the immediate and provisional, his is a valued presence. So I thought if we could first begin with, you, like grounding us in what kind of this poetry is that doesn't have designs on the immediate, with a favorite poem, or I think we don't have to turn it on.
Hello? Is it on? Okay.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Thad and Kai, for arranging this. It's great to be here. I thought I would start by reading a poem, reading the first poem that he published, Salute, which was also the first poem, the poem that he almost always began his own readings with when he finally began giving them in 1988. It's a poem that he wrote in the mental hospital in 1951 after his first mental breakdown and right after first meeting Frank O'Hara and John Ashbery at a Larry Rivers opening. And as he later said, the poem was very much influenced by a particular poem of Frank O'Hara that he had read called The Threepenny Opera. Although it doesn't sound a bit like Frank O'Hara, what he borrowed from O'Hara was what he called its rhythm, its jazz-like rhythm, and certain other formal aspects. Salute. Past is past, and if one remembers what one meant to do and never did, is not to have thought to do enough. Like that gathering of one of each I planned, to gather one of each kind of clover, daisy, paintbrush that grew in that field the cabin stood in, and study them one afternoon before they wilted. Past is past. I salute that various field. So Jimmy, at that time, he was 28, I think, and a late bloomer for a poet. And he, the poem sort of considers the idea of not becoming a poet, really, and yet by writing the poem, he fulfills his intentions and he sort of the poem changes the past in that sense and changes the poem itself.
It also seemed like valedictory to me, except then it's a 28-year-old. So he reads that at his first reading when he was 65 years old, talking about not having designs on the immediate, and then you feel it's sort of the looking back of this grand poet or something.
Right,
but,
right. He was also, in a way, looking back at his failed relationship with his first lover, Bill Alto, because that's whom he shared that cabin with that he's referring to.
Anyway, so I love your book.
Thank you.
You turn out to be the perfect biographer for James Schuyler, but part of that is also, he was always doing things out of time or on his own time. It's already been mentioned that it took you 20 years, I've heard 30 years to to write this, and so especially in a room full of at least some biographers, I think people are interested in, and not at all judgmental because it's biographers,
Right.
interested in your kind of process. How did it begin, and how did it go?
Well, I was fortunate enough to know Schuyler at the end of his life for a year or two. We became quite close, really. And then he died suddenly, and we were all heartbroken. And somehow I got it into my head that I wanted to write a biography. I'm not sure how it started. Maybe after he died, Joe Brainerd sent me a stack of the letters that Schuyler had written him. And anyway, I decided to approach his executor, Dara Park, with the idea of writing a biography, and Dara said, no, I haven't decided who should write the biography yet. But he very generously and imaginatively suggested that I edit his diary, and I leapt at that chance. His diary didn't need much editing. What it needed was transcription and collation. But I also provided quite a few footnotes to it, and I also compiled a chronology to accompany it, kind of thinking ahead to maybe one day actually doing a biography. So the diary project started in 1994. It was published in 97. From 1997 till 2003, I did not do any Schuyler work. But then in 2003, Jonathan Galassi at Farrar Straus came back to me with a proposal that I write the biography. So I happily agreed to do that. So then, of course, life intervenes, and there were many interruptions between 2003 and 2024, I guess, when I finally finished it. But that's the story.
Okay, thank you. And how did you approach childhood? I mean, I think that it seems that certain figures connect to their childhood in ways, like you mentioned Schuyler being boyish and things. I know when I was writing the Frank O'Hara biography, Grace Hardigan said to me, "Oh, you leave all that behind," which is that Frank had just kind of invented himself, and that's what they were doing in a way. They didn't care about the past, they didn't care about their childhood, and they didn't really connect to it, according to her. I was wondering how you found Schuyler connecting to his boyhood.
Well, I wanted to be thorough, and so I tried to find out as much as I could about his childhood, and it was a little bit frustrating that I couldn't find out as much as I wanted to. But in writing about not only his childhood, but also his ancestry, even his parents' lives, I tried to find connections to what he became later on. And for example, when he was about 6 or 7, his parents divorced, and that was a real trauma for him. But at the same time, his grandmother moved into the family, moved in with him and his mother, and took care of him a lot. Took him out to the museums and parks in Washington, D.C., and where they lived. And that had a tremendous influence, I feel, on his poetry. His love of nature, he was an early introduction to art. And also, I think his ability to couch deep feeling to sort of tamp down deep feeling under a surface of everyday beauty, because his grandmother herself was at that time mourning the death of her eldest son on a terrible accident on the farm where she and he lived together. So I think she, in focusing on him as a little boy, she was also teaching him how to move from sorrow into nature and the art world and physical beauty of the world.
But he also had, like in Alfred and Guinevere, then he has that child sense, I think, or characters.
Right. His first novel was called Alfred and Guinevere, and it was a strange novel told entirely in the words of these children. Nothing happens in the novel. But yet beneath the surface there are terrible things, a violent death and the threat of divorce. It's a hard novel to get a grasp on, like childhood is.
Right. And like his other novel, Nest of Ninnies, the collaboration with John Ashbery, another.
Which is also mostly talk.
Right.
I mean, a lot of it is.
Right. And what about part of the geography? I mean, he always seems kind of Midwestern, plain spoken, and some kind of cliche that I have about that. But he was actually he moved around a lot, right?
Well, not too much. His parents were from the Midwest, and he went to college in West Virginia, right next to Ohio, which was kind of like the Midwest. But he was born in Chicago. His parents moved to Washington, D.C. when he was quite young. And then after the divorce, when he was in junior high school, they moved to, his mother remarried, and they moved to Buffalo, New York. And then shortly thereafter, to a suburb called East Aurora, New York, which is where Schuyler grew up through his late childhood and adolescence. And then as soon as he could, he moved to New York.
Right.
And lived there for the rest of his life.
Yeah, I mean, it seems, and in writing your biography, once he's in New York, he's like
He's there.
very recognizable, and the template of his life gets set up pretty quickly, I think. I mean, first, because he's friends with W.H. Auden and Chester Coleman, and then he has a breakdown, and he has an abusive boyfriend. So the ingredients of his life are there pretty quickly.
Yes, that's.
So could you talk a little about the Auden influence on him in terms of writing? And
Auden was somebody he reacted against, but also absorbed. They became friends sort of by chance through Auden's lover, Chester Coleman, who was Schuyler's best friend. So they were kind of a foursome, Chester and Auden and Schuyler and Bill Alto, his then lover. But when they were in Italy together, Schuyler started, helped Auden out by typing his poems. And as he was doing so, he was recognizing that the formal qualities of Auden's verse were not something that he ever wanted to emulate. And on the contrary, the strongest influence he acknowledged at that time in his early thinking about writing poetry was D.H. Lawrence. But later on, in the 50s, his then lover, Arthur Gold, encouraged him to write in regular forms. Arthur Gold had a rather more conventional taste in poetry, and was a good friend of Elizabeth Bishop, for example, and so on. So Schuyler obliged, and the poems that he then wrote were very much influenced by Auden. He wrote sonnets and sestinas and a villanelle, which is quite almost a response to one of Auden's famous villanelles. So it was but at that period, John Ashbery, his great friend, was outraged, and he said, when they would meet, he would say, "Have you written anything lately that will interest me?"
right.
And he did give that up after a short time.
But it is interesting, the Auden. Has anyone written an Auden and the New York School article, essay, book? Because this closeness with Schuyler, and then he was as the judge of the Yale Younger Poets Prize when it was between John Ashbery and Frank O'Hara, and he chose John Ashbery. So he was present as the older, partly because he was gay, maybe, but the
his parties were
before, and he had parties.
He had parties, and I think John wrote a paper about him at Harvard.
Oh yeah.
Earlier. Yeah, he was definitely in the air.
And then it seems that sort of around 1952, it's this kind of annus mirabilis where he meets Frank O'Hara, he meets John Ashbery, and then this seems to have a very big effect on him.
It sure did. He felt that was the most important moment of his life when he met Ashbery and O'Hara, and they recognized that they were kindred spirits, that his poetry was akin to theirs in some way, or at least they recognized him as a poet. I don't think they ever really compared their poetry together. I mean, they weren't a school in the sense that they had a common goal,
Right.
but they were reacting against some of the same things.
Mm-hmm.
And they were friends and they hung out together.
Right. No, but that's interesting. What was it that that connected that group? Because
Yeah.
they all denied it. I mean, especially John Ashbery was very critical of this New York School poetry term. You know, they didn't like being joined together.
Yes.
And indeed, it's an unlikely comparison. I mean, even putting John Ashbery next to Frank O'Hara, next to James Schuyler on
Right.
the page. So what was he, how was he part of this group in terms of poetry?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think they ever defined the New York School themselves. So, you know, it's funny to be asked to define it now. But you were saying earlier that Schuyler's kind of more of a romantic figure than Ashbery, say. I mean, a poet maudit. He had this sort of very difficult life in almost the romantic sense.
Mm-hmm. And that begins early. I mean, the way you write about it, it's still in this sort of Auden time that he has his first breakdown and
Yeah.
goes to a branch of Payne Whitney, and then he has this kind of dark relationship with someone. Could you talk about those?
Which one?
two.
The
Bill Alto.
Bill
I'm
Alto,
thinking of,
yeah.
yes. Well, yeah. I mean, this is a pattern.
It was a pattern.
As we just proved, this is a pattern, right?
Bill Alto was a fascinating figure. He was a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, tall and sort of very handsome and dashing and full of charisma. He had lost an arm in a training accident after the Spanish Civil War during the First World War, so he was invalided out of the army in the Second World War. Sorry, not the first. Yeah, they had this tumultuous relationship, which involved, some abuse apparently of Alto by, Schuyler had basically a masochistic nature, it seems, and Alto, obliged. Their relationship ended very, very violently on Ischia when Alto became jealous of Schuyler's budding relationship with another man and chased him around the kitchen table with a carving knife. And they were throwing plates at each other, and Auden wrote back, having heard a report of this, I fear that there's not a single piece of crockery left in the house. So Alto disappeared after that point. But, how many years later, 20 years later, he had a relationship that had some kind of similar dynamics with another man called Robert Jordan. Mm-hmm. And that was Schuyler discussed, he didn't really discuss it, but friends recognized that there was a sadomasochistic element to that relationship. And the funny thing is, Robert Jordan is the name of the character in Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. And Bill Alto was one of the 3 or 4 Lincoln Brigade fighters who Robert Jordan, the fictional Robert Jordan, was based upon.
Mm-hmm. Well.
Fun facts to know.
Right. I mean, it seems to me, I'm not sure about the timing of it, but again, talking about his poetry and where it came from, there are these kind of narrow poems with narrow lines that are very sort of observational often and clear, and then he gets into these long meditative poems at a certain point that
Yeah.
that are, so are those, where does that come from, this kind of
The long line, it comes from Whitman,
Uh-huh.
basically, or that's what he would say. In you know, the first one of these poems with the long lines, the Crystal Lithium, he was explicitly inspired to begin after rereading Whitman, and he continued. There's a sort of a series of 4 great long poems with these long lines: the Crystal Lithium, Hymn to Life, the morning of the poem, and a few days. Which sort of the line keeps getting longer and longer, and so he has to break it up, and it finally becomes too long to be a line, and it's sort of 2 lines, kind of indented. But it's you know, it's, as Alice Notley said, he really expanded the possibilities of what you could do in that kind of form. He invented that form, really, and it worked for him. He also compared it a little bit. The morning of the poem, he compared in its tone to his letters that he had been writing recent in those days to his 2 main correspondents, John Ashbery and Joe Brainerd.
I mean, I want to get into some larger issues of his life and poetry a little bit, but he did have, in terms of relationships, he also had these patrons, I would think, and he had a sort of bite the hand that feeds you relationship with them, as I recall. So
Kinda.
I mean, partly he was, which we haven't talked about, involved with Fairfield Porter, the painter, and Fairfield was married and had a family, and Schuyler went and lived with them. His wife, Ann Porter, said that he came for the weekend and stayed for 11 years. So that's a kind of, you know, Schuyler relationship with someone who's both patron
Right.
and they're in some ways in love with each other.
Right.
Do you see that pattern in his life?
Yes, definitely. I think it stems from his broken family life. You know, he always seemed to be searching for a family to move into. You know, beginning even back in his childhood, right after the divorce, there was another family living in the same apartment building, and they seemed to be a very happy sort of upper middle class family. The father was an architect. And, you know, Jimmy, he took imaginatively joined that family, because that was, those kids became transformed into the characters of Alfred and Guinevere. So you see throughout his life him kind of moving into surrogate families in slight ways, and of course very much a major way with the Porter family. You know, Porter was in love with him, and Jimmy was first resistant to that, and then kind of, I think, took advantage of that a little bit. He did love Fairfield, but it wasn't a passionate love, but it was a very close platonic love, I guess you could say, that included benefits, as we now say.
Right.
So yeah, he lived there for 12 years, and the end of it was not happy. They felt that the Porters felt that they were simply not enabling him to develop self-reliance, that he'd become too dependent upon them, and it was kind of almost for his own good that they'd wanted to make him leave. But of course, it had become just too much for them too. Their kids were. Their children's, the 2 girls' childhoods were quite distorted by having this strange man living with them for all those years. But then another patron was Kenwood Elmsley, who was a grandson of Joseph Pulitzer, and a poet and a publisher and a wonderful, funny person. And he helped Schuyler by setting up in the 70s a trust fund for him that paid at what was at that time barely enough to live on. It became not quite enough after a while. But still, it was a generous thing to do, and that eventually ended up ending their friendship. Although, he didn't retract the trust fund. He did retreat from the friendship. Kenward did.
And there was Morris Goldie, there was James Merrill at a certain point. I mean, I think what I was talking about, this might have been before, what seemed like a kind of romantic poet figure in terms of Schuyler. I mean, Frank O'Hara and John Ashbery seemed part of our modern world, and they had jobs, and they fit their poetry into that.
Yes.
But Schuyler was really,
Out there.
yeah, out there, and you just felt, I mean, he could only write poetry, and if someone didn't help him, what was going to happen to him? I mean, there was always that sense.
Yes, yeah.
So,
I mean, he did have a job at the Museum of Modern Art. He had a job in a bookstore. And he had, he had jobs, but he wasn't terribly good at them. Frankly,
right.
he had,
Yeah. No, I mean, he had this negative capability in life.
Yes,
I mean,
right.
He just couldn't, and which is part of then also the mental illness. I mean, he wasn't kidding around.
Yeah, right.
In that way. So could you discuss something about that and how this fit in?
Yeah, well, his mental illness, I mean, I don't know what to say about that. It was kind of a form of I'm blanking on all these terms.
Schizophrenia?
Yes, partly.
Bipolar? No.
What's it when the bipolar condition?
Bipolar, okay.
And a little bit of schizophrenia. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's interesting.
Yeah. But he used that first poem that I read, Salute, was written in the mental hospital. It was a form of a cure, really. And Schuyler had by then lived in Italy for 2 years, and he was aware that the word salute in Italian means health. And I think that throughout his life, he used his poetry as a bulwark against mental illness, because when you read his poems, the last thing you think that they are is the work of somebody who's mentally ill, and they seem the paradigm of sheer sanity and clarity. And I think he needed that. He created that for himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the second great line about Schuyler that I wrote down to get right was you in the book where you said, even at his most deranged, he could appear and perhaps be calm and rational in his writing. So I think that's part of the specialness. I mean, it is this kind of meditative work that's going on, and the world seems so clear in it. And,
Yes, right.
And to be doing that in the midst of all this chaos, self-created or not, is fascinating.
The poet Eileen Miles described coming into his room one day when he was having a bad time, and he looked terrible, and he was red in the face, and he was looked like he was going to explode, and he was writing this poem. And later Eileen looked at the poem, and it was what she described, they described as full of these calm beauties that he was. So he was just writing this calmness in the midst of, and then that same afternoon he had to go to the hospital.
Right. Yeah. With your permission, I'll write a favorite poem of mine there are a series of Payne Whitney poems that he wrote, a cycle of them, which are great. And a favorite of mine that I'll read is called What? What's in those pills? After lunch, and I can hardly keep my eyes open. Oh, for someone to talk small talk with. Even a dog would do. Why are they hammering iron outside? And what is that generator whose fierce hum comes in the window? What is a poem, anyway? The daffodils, the heather, and the freesias all speak to me. I speak back, like St. Francis and the wolf of Gubbio. So, I mean, that's an astonishing combination of this kind of hallucinogenic, transcendental vision and this total ordinariness, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the flowers did speak to him.
Meaning what?
I think he had a connection to to the natural world.
Yeah.
He,
I mean, that is such a special part of his work, the pastoral, in that way. I mean, how does he handle that? Because it's so different from what we might. It's not Wordsworth.
No.
What is the pastoral in Schuyler's poems?
Well, it's almost as much about urban life as the country, but it certainly is about. But it's about, about looking and experiencing, and as you say, negative capability, just letting it flow into him. Mm-hmm. He once compared himself to a crystal radio, accepting messages from all over. That's how I would. It's a very passive, mode.
Right. But then in the middle of the passivity, there's this powerful
True.
kind of voice that comes through, right?
Right.
So you're having like this looking around and seeing freesias and hearing the generator, and then he's saying, and I'm like St. Francis talking talking to the wolves. That's very
Yes, right.
strong, I guess.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And also his pastoral, to me, you said urban, which is a good way to say it, or it seemed painterly. I mean, it seemed like a almost artificial, too, at the same time. I mean, he looked
Right.
at the same way Fairfield Porter was painting.
Well, one can't emphasize enough the importance that the painters had for all of these poets, the painters whom they spent all their time with. Larry Rivers and Fairfield Porter and Jane Freilich and Grace Hartigan, the so-called, most of them, except for Fairfield, of the so-called, they were their own generation, the so-called second generation abstract painters, plus Larry Rivers, whatever he was. They were always in and out of their studios, and they took inspiration from them. I think in the idea of experimentation and the way abstract painters can be. I'm blanking again.
Not bipolar.
No.
Well, he did. I mean, one thing I remember, there's a Schuyler essay where he says, in the 50s, the painters and the poets were in the same boat, but the painters were steering. So that's the kind of self-deprecation that he
Right.
had, and also showed how much he was trying to do something painterly.
Yes.
A little bit.
Some of his poems read like he's describing a scene the way a painter would render it.
Mm-hmm. Right. But the other thing that he has that we touched on a little is also this religion and spirituality, I think, and that to me, that always, like St. Francis talking to the wolves, it came through sort of between the lines sometimes. It also came through in his life, correct? Like he would have, what was his relationship with Jesus in his breakdowns?
Right. Well, he was brought up a Presbyterian. His parents became Christian Scientists, which he loathed. He really didn't go to belong to any church for most of his life, but he had a strange attraction to the Catholic Church for a lot of his life. I think a kind of a romantic attraction in the sense that, Oscar Wilde might have had an attraction to the Catholic Church. And during several of his breakdowns, he felt he was embodying Christ. And he sort of went through the motions of a crucifixion scene. And once when he was being taken, in 1971, when he was being taken to the mental hospital by a policeman, and he was sitting in the back seat of the police car with John Ashbery, he asked John, "You do believe that I'm the resurrection and the life, don't you?" And John answered, "Oh yeah, sure." So this imagery ideation would come up in his mental breakdowns. But in the 80s, he was inspired by his friend Tom Carey partly to join the Episcopal Church, and he became an active churchgoer, Church of the Incarnation on Madison Avenue here, and became a lay reader, and was buried from that church.
Right. But
right around the corner from here are Madison and 35th Street. It does it. Oh, yeah.
he also said he had this poem, Our Father.
Yeah.
Again, written in Payne Whitney or
Written in
branch
Waterbury in
thereof.
Vermont.
Oh, that was in Vermont.
Yeah, in the mental hospital in Vermont, yes.
Anyway, I had this line, have been on heavy religious praise God creative trip. Poems pour out. So it does seem that this was a faucet for him, or a source. First of
Right.
all, these mental institutions were very good for his poetry, and then and also something about spirituality, right?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
But I'm not sure. You have to. That's kind of what I'm asking.
What you're
about, is
asking?
How serious do we take the religion and spirituality in James Schuyler?
I think it's there, for sure. I mean, he wrote a poem about it. I forget what it's called, but he sort of itemizes his various flip-flops. I do believe in God. I don't believe in God. I'm a Catholic. I'm not a Catholic. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, he comes up with a conclusion. In the end, I believe I'll die in the grace of, I forget what it goes, but it's how it goes. But the conclusion is that he believes in God and in the church, mm-hmm. the Catholic Church. But in the end, he didn't go into the Catholic Church, as I said. But then, John Ashbery once asked him, he once told John Ashbery, I'm not all that religious. And John said, I never thought you were. So he went back and forth on it.
Right. That's funny. One question that people ask biographers annoyingly, I think, to me, but is how did your relationship with the subject change by the end, or didn't you come to dislike your subject as you found out more about them? And when you have a kind of double situation, since you knew him personally, mm-hmm. and you know him and finding out more through a biography. So how can you describe your relationship with Jimmy Schuyler?
I did not have that reaction of coming to loathe my subject that many biographers do. He was a wonderful, wonderful person, and the more I learned about him, the more I felt that, actually. I certainly saw his flaws, and they were, and I exposed them, some of them. Mm-hmm. But we all have flaws, Lord knows. I became more deeply appreciative of him, I think, mm-hmm. as a result of delving into his life.
Mm-hmm. And where did you land in terms of your feelings about his poetry, or did you learn more or see it differently from doing this book?
Certainly, I learned more, and I originally wasn't planning to really. I didn't think I would really discuss the poetry. But I guess Jonathan maybe said that I should, and I started doing it, and I found I really enjoyed it, and learned as I was doing it more about the poetry. So I felt that was really valuable. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did you learn anything else about how he composed it, or anything that was?
Well, yes, some technical things about,
Surprising.
I mean, he was interesting to learn that he had explicitly been influenced by Olson's field
Right.
method of writing poetry. And I was fascinated to then read Olson's essay and learn that he kind of based that theory on writing poetry on the typewriter, which Schuyler more often than not used for writing poetry. I thought that was kind of an interesting technical point.
Mm-hmm. I think what I learned then in your book was this way in which which I mentioned, this calm, meditative poetry was being written in the middle of this, what Eileen Miles called franticness.
Yes.
And so therefore it was not even, it was his self-medication through poetry in a certain way. I think,
Right.
Like that I hadn't
Right.
quite seen so clearly.
Mm.
I think this is a moment where I saw someone raising their hand while we were talking, so definitely with you, but if we have other people have questions. She has a question here, right?
Thank you so much. This is just fascinating to me. I wondered if you ever came across the name Alice Baber, another painter who's the subject of my forthcoming biography, and whose first show Schuyler reviewed for the great editor of Art News, Tom Hess, in 1958, her first New York show. And he did a great job. It's how we even know what was in the show. And later, John Ashbery reviews her in Paris. But what happened? Was it just Schuyler's mental breakdown why he stopped writing, reviewing art? Because he was wonderful in 1958. And so I'd love to hear more about that. Thank you.
Okay, yes. He began writing art criticism in the mid-50s, and he did stop in 1960 or 61 when he went into the hospital again, this time in New Haven. And when he came out, he went straight to Southampton and lived with the Porters for 11 years. So he didn't really, he did write some articles after that, some feature articles in 66 and 67 for Art News, when John Ashbery was an editor there. And later on in the 80s, he also wrote some art criticism for when friends of his would have shows, like Ann Dunn or Dara Park, he would review those. But yeah, the spate, Art News in the 50s was amazing because they reviewed every show that went on in New York, albeit like 300-word short reviews, but they were very concise and pithy reviews. And Tom Hess had the brilliant idea of hiring poets to write these reviews, and it was a kind of a golden age of Art News then.
Alice Baber was from Illinois, and he's born in Chicago, and he specifically complimented her for painting with a New York accent.
Oh, that's nice to know. Yeah, I did not come across her name in my research, so I don't know that they met personally, but they could well have. Yeah.
Yes.
You said he didn't use a typewriter.
He did use a typewriter.
Oh, he did.
He did, as often as not, he wrote with a typewriter, but not always. About half the time, I would say.
When it was not a typewriter, did he have a pen here? Did he have a pencil there? Was the paper lined? Was he always prepared for a poem? I mean, how did it come out of his head into, something tangible?
Different ways. When he got into that, when he was doing art reviews, he got into the habit of carrying a little slender notebook in his pocket.
Lines?
I guess, yeah, with lines. and and so he would take his notes at galleries that way, and he also started writing poems in that. And that was how he began to write these skinny poems, because the words wouldn't fit not very many words would fit across a line. And so he said, he intended to kind of extend the line when he went back and typed the poem out, but he found that he liked the way it was attenuated that way and kept them in skinny poems. So yeah.
Can you talk about Schuyler's papers? Like what was left that he didn't collect, or unfinished poems, or unfinished prose
Right.
pieces? Where is all that, and what is it?
His papers, it's amazing that he kept as much as he did with all the vicissitudes of his life, but he had quite a few boxes of papers that survived a fire in his apartment and were sent to storage and were, all kinds of adventures they went through. But they finally were sold to the University of California at San Diego, which was a major help to him at the end of his life. He didn't live to receive the second installment, but he got the first installment of, I think it was sold for $70,000. And they're there, and there are a lot of unpublished poems, drafts for poems. A lot of those unpublished poems were subsequently published in the book called Other Flowers. But I think a review needs to be made of some of those poems to maybe look at them again. Short prose. He kept trying to write novels, and he would start a novel, and he said he's written more unfinished novels than anyone since Homer was a pup. But unfortunately, there isn't evidence of that in the papers. There are a few fragmentary prose sketches that might have been the beginnings of novels, but they don't go very far. But they're interesting as far as they do go. And of course, letters that he received. He pretty much kept letters from his friends going back to the 50s. His wonderful correspondence with John Ashbery and Joe Brainerd and others. Unfortunately, not going into the 40s. There's nothing to speak of from Auden or Bill Alto or anyone like that, which is a shame. Or Chester, no. I don't know that they wrote. I guess they must have written letters, but perhaps not as many. Hello.
Question about Dara Park. He had, and certainly was involved in his life later on, but what was Dara Park's relationship with Jimmy Schuyler during his lifetime?
Dara Park met Schuyler in the early 70s through Bob Dash. Bob Dash, he and Dara Park were having some kind of relationship. They claimed they weren't lovers, but they were very close. And they would spend the summers together at Bob Dash's garden in Bridgehampton, Long Island, which is now open to the public, Milieu. Dara Park was just becoming a painter. He had been somewhat reluctantly involved in the business world, but he decided to leave that and become a painter. So Bob Dash was, for one thing, teaching him to paint. And Bob Dash was a very close friend of Schuyler's, and that's how Dara met him, was through one summer in particular when they spent a lot of time together.
Hi, I'm wondering how you used oral history, and I mean, you took yours, and that might have been a gift because there were probably people who have passed that you got to speak to. There are a few people, of course, who are still alive, not that many. But
Right.
I'm wondering, was that a gift of, because it took so many time? I mean, how many people were you able to speak to over the course of your own research?
I think I counted them up once to be 134, and it was fortunate that I started with the diary research in 1994 because I was able to interview a number of people who had already died by 2003. So yeah, that was a big help in that sense.
Hi, I have a question. You mentioned earlier the novel co-written with John Ashbery, Nest of Ninnies,
Yes.
which is like a delightful, droll kind of comedy of manners. But I was in reading about it, and I haven't read the biography yet. But I'm just curious if you had more information, or in your reading could detect like who wrote what passages, how it was composed. I know they wrote some of it together, like when they were going to the Hamptons, et cetera. But I'm just curious what your accounts maybe you got from interviewing John Ashbery and looking at the papers and things like that.
Yeah, he kind of couldn't say much about it. They did pass a yellow legal sheet back and forth, and they would write sentences together. And then I think as the time went on, they wrote longer passages. There are in his archives, there are some manuscripts. You can see the two different handwritings on the page, but not for the whole novel. I don't recall that there was much of that, but there was some of that, yeah. So I think they would start with shorter sections, and then as they got further along, they would each write a longer bit. But John later said he could, looking back, he could not remember which parts he had written and which Jimmy has written, which, their correspondence also has the same kind of feeling that they're interchangeable. It's one, it's a conversation, but it's all one voice in a way.
I had a question about the photographs that you mentioned in the book, that he took up photography in Maine. And what's the state of those photographs? Are they in the papers in San Diego, or how many are there? Or like?
Yeah, they're in there. They have the negatives and the contact sheets. Not a huge number. I don't know how many rolls of it's a 35 millimeter film. I think some color. I don't remember seeing the color, frankly, but I remember a dozen, 20 rolls of black and white. I'm not sure because I took copies of certain ones, but maybe not all of them. But yeah, that's a great project for somebody. In fact, somebody approached me about doing a book or a project with his photographs, and I hope somebody does it.
Yeah, I had a question. It's kind of for both of you. There's a sense, of course, with the New York School poets that the poetry is continuous with life, and something that can be generated from that in the case of Schuyler and Anohara is this sort of maybe unearned sense of familiarity that readers have, that they end up with not so much with readers, but with like acolytes, or that there's a kind of a sense that the reader gets from the poetry, not just through the biographical detail, but also their voice, that the speaker of the poem. And I wondered what consciousness you had of that, both as biographers of these subjects, that you had readers who perhaps already felt that they had a sense of the lives of these poets in this poetry that can contain so much of their lives, of their relationships, their friendships, through name dropping or whatever mechanisms. Yeah.
You first.
I mean, one thing about it is what a gamble it all was. I think so. Certainly like when Frank O'Hara was writing these poems with the names of his friends, Larry and Jane, the reaction was, who cares? Or just thinking, oh, no one is going to care in 25 years. So if you want to be an important poet, then don't put the name of Jimmy in your poem. So that it sort of changed the distance almost between the reader and the poet, to have that kind of detail, and that was something that they did have in common. I also think when you're talking about the voice and Nest of Ninnies, and as different as their poems were, I mean, even sort of in person, that group had this way of speaking that was interchangeable, basically. And there was like a way of ironically weighing down on certain words, and everything was in quotation marks, and then, and then there would be long silences. So that there was they were very different. It wasn't a school per se. At the same time, they were protesting a little too much because there was this similarity of voice in there too, I think.
Yes, that's true. Tom?
When you were talking about, I have a very loud voice. When you were talking about the novels, the one novel you didn't mention was What's for Dinner, which concerns a family. And there's and it occurred to me as I was getting ready to ask this question that actually Schuyler, I think, identifies with the woman in that story, which is all about alcoholism, and she gets institutionalized. Anyway, I'll throw it over to you.
Lottie, yes. I think he does, yes. She goes into the mental hospital for alcoholism. They don't really describe whatever actually sent her into the novel doesn't describe what sent her there. It's sort of, she's suddenly there in the hospital, and the reason is given as alcoholism. And the rest of the novel is Schuyler making up these conversations with all these characters that she encounters in the mental hospital.
So have to be the last question.
Hi. My question is really, I'm assuming that most of the people that are here are familiar with Schuyler and have read Schuyler and love to read poetry, but I'm here because I know you, Nathan, and all the things, or many of the things that you've quoted from Schuyler, even just little snippets, are funny. And I like funny. I mean, I do love Joe Brainard, and I love Stevie Smith and other poets that are funny. And would you say Schuyler is known for humor, or I'm a little bit afraid of real poetry, like some people are. What would you say to me?
Yes, I would say he in person, he was known for a quiet wit. Yes, definitely. And some of that comes through in his poetry. I recommend it to you very highly.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nathan, for your fantastic, sure-footed book.
Thank you.
And I also wanted to thank Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation for their generous support. Good night.